Okay, welcome to today's show. We're speaking with educator, speaker, and author Patrice Bain, whose latest book is Powerful Teaching, A Guide for Parents, published by Catt Educational. Welcome, Patrice.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me.
Yes, it's our pleasure, and I think our audience will be delighted to hear from you as well. So we'll get right into it. One of the things that I've noticed in your previous writing from the initial Powerful Teaching book and the strategies that are a part of that is that you've noted rightly that quality research in education is hard to find. It's often kind of hidden or at least unclear where to find it. And even if teachers do know where the research is, it's hard to find time to go through it and read it and familiarize and make sense of it and apply it. I know you've been using cognitive research in your practice as a teacher for 15 plus years. What got you started in the process of familiarizing yourself with the research and really accessing and using it?
Great question. I was so fortunate. It was one of those cases of being in the right place at the right time. Back in 2006, most research that was done on how people learn was done at universities, in laboratories, with college students. And in 2006, two cognitive scientists, Dr. Henry Roediger III and Dr. Mark McDaniel, who wrote Make It Stick, a wonderful book, wanted to see how do students learn in an authentic classroom. So they wrote a large grant, they got the grant, and the classroom that they used was mine. So I got to be pretty much on the cutting edge because I believe my classroom, if not the first, one of the first, where this robust research was happening. And so I learned along with the researchers. It was fabulous. I remember thinking, I know my students do well, but I don't know why. And I wanted to be involved in the research to try to figure out, why do my students do well? I knew it wasn't because I was some amazing teacher. I knew what I did, other teachers could do, and I knew the research would help me figure that out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure that it has uncovered quite a lot. And it's interesting now, very timely, that with the new book, that you're really translating and bringing a lot of that message to parents and I think also to students and really all of those different stakeholders in this educational exercise that we call schooling, right? And
Right.
so with remote schooling happening, super timely, parents are more involved than ever. I think getting new perspectives on what is my child learning? How do I understand if they're progressing? How can I help? How did you go about that process when you started of thinking, okay, we've developed these strategies that we know work and that we've determined a way that we can communicate them to educators. Now we want to bring them to stakeholders who are involved in the process who don't have that training or background of being a professional educator, but are just as important to the process. How did you engage in that process of translating that content and that message to make sure that you can engage all of those parties?
Because I was not only invested in the research, but so confident in how successful it was, that throughout my teaching, I always wanted to involve the parents as much as possible. So whether it was at meet and greets or at open houses or at parent-teacher conferences, I took every opportunity to talk to parents about learning. And after I had written Powerful Teaching and I was traveling around the country speaking to groups of teachers, a common question that I was asked was, we want to do these things, but when and how can we talk to parents about them? And so I knew this idea for this book had been brewing for some time. And I knew the time had come with so much happening with remote learning, I started doing some research and realized that only 10% of the millions of students in the United States have parents that are certified educators, which means 90% aren't. And parents are struggling. It's science, but it's so accessible. And I knew that it was time to write this book and get it out there.
And have you heard just over the past 6 months or so here that we've really had the most severe effects of the pandemic and remote learning and students learning at home, from educators who are, either wishing that they had adopted some of the strategies earlier on of making sure that they're communicating to parents and getting them engaged, or how they're sort of working through the process now, with that understanding of the role that parents are playing. And I think seeing that more clearly, even though it's a role that parents can and should have been playing all along, and many were, but weren't necessarily always receiving that same communication, right, from the teachers to say, here's your role, here's how you can help, here's what you can do. Have you been hearing things more recently from teachers who are saying, here's how I'm getting myself used to doing this as well?
I am. I'm quite active on Twitter, and like I said, I was going to school districts all around the country. Now I'm doing it virtually. And I am hearing many teachers who are using the strategies that I developed. They're using them, and what I love most is they're tweaking them, and they're finding ways to reach parents. That being said, I know this is such a difficult time because teachers are under more pressure right now, with possibly in school, with remote, with hybrid parents. And so now is the time. If the information wasn't out before, it is really time now. What I talk about is efficient, and it's effective, and it boosts learning. And now's the time to be using this.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for teachers who are new to your work and don't yet know as much about the powerful teaching work that you've done in that model, it's based on kind of 4 strategies that you call power tools. Can you briefly just explain what those 4 strategies are, and just why they are the 4 things that have really come up in your research and your practice?
Sure. The reason why we call them power tools is that because they are 4 researched principles. Robust research has proven time and time again that these principles really boost and enhance learning. And so there are 4 of them that we call power tools because they are so powerful. The first one is retrieval. And retrieval is the process of pulling information out. When I talk to teachers, I tell them that every year on my first day of teaching, I would tell my students, I'm your teacher and I'm going to teach you how to learn. And these power tools became common language. And I would start by telling my students, let's go to the basics. How do we learn? And the first step is encoding, where you get information to the students. And the second is storage. We've provided the information and now it's in your heads. But too often, that's where it stops. And what is so important is that third step, that is retrieval. Once the information is in our students' heads, we need to make it so the students have access to it, to pull it out, to use it. And that's retrieval, and that's that first power tool. And so it's that process of pulling that information out. The second power tool is spacing. And as teachers, we all know to review, and we do it. But spacing is more than a simple review. It is purposeful, it's intentional, and it is retrieving again. And there's so much research that shows once a student is able to retrieve, if we don't go back to it, that information is gone. And that's why if something has been taught the previous year and a teacher will ask something the following year and they get these blank, clueless stares, it's because that information wasn't retrieved. The third principle or power tool is interleaving. And that shows how to have students discriminate, to be able to compare and contrast. And the fourth power tool is feedback-driven metacognition. I know all teachers can identify with a student who came in and said, "Oh, I studied so hard last night. I'm going to ace this test." And you're so excited for this student. And as you're grading that test, you see the student did not do well. And that's because often when students study, they study what they already know. And it's so powerful to be able to have students identify what they know versus what they don't know prior to any big stakes exams, so they can focus on the areas of study that really need it. So retrieval, spacing, interleaving, and feedback-driven metacognition are those four power tools. And I explain those in the parent guide so parents understand that if something was learned a month ago, ask about it again. You know, the guide is filled with tips and strategies that parents can use at home.
Yeah, and I believe, from my understanding, another piece or another way in which this book can apply is getting students to also understand these processes and have a better idea of what's happening with their own learning, and how are they progressing through their understanding, and eventually understanding that better so they can kind of take ownership and make smart decisions about their own learning.
Let me talk about that for a second, because you are so on target with that. In fact, what I found is that the students who tended to struggle the most are the ones who absolutely flourished once they learned how to learn. That it's almost like, I've said this before, it's almost like learning was this party that they had not been invited to. And once you open their eyes, you open their knowledge to how to learn, they absolutely flourish. And students, I have had students come to me thrilled at their high grade, but then they would say to me, "But Mrs. Bain, I've never done well before. I'm not smart." And that would get me every time. And I would say, "But look at you now. You have an A or a B." And the difference is now you know how to learn. That there are too many students who have internalized failure simply because no one taught them how to learn. We can change this.
Right. If they're used to seeing only the outcome and with lack of clarity around the process, how are they supposed to really have insight into what are the things I can do as a student that I am going to learn? I know that I can learn. I have ability. And
Exactly.
so, that would be kind of, I think it all ties together. And this question is probably not a very easy question to develop these through lines, but when we think about each of these stakeholders, and we'll keep it at the classroom level, so you have teacher, parent, student, that are all involved in that process. Are there one or two keys that you would put forth to enable us to have better, more productive conversations around the learning process with all of those stakeholders engaged and in mind, and understanding that they all have a role, they all are on the same team, and we want to be on the same page? How do we just make sure that there's better, more productive, and more frequent, just ongoing, continuous conversations happening around the learning process?
Well, I call that the teaching triangle, because the parent, the student, and the teacher, they all play such an important role in this. Oftentimes, the parents are left out of this equation, but they too play such an important role. One of the reasons is your teacher one year might be thoroughly cognizant of using research, and then the next year, perhaps not. But as the parent, you're the parent every year. So by helping to know these strategies, you're really able to help your student. Again, just strategies that are used at school can also be reinforced at home. Simple things like, instead of, as a parent, saying, "How was your day?" Well, we all know the answer to, right?
Right.
And instead, a simple retrieval. Tell me two things you learned in social studies today. Just learning simple strategies like that go from having your students just keep things in storage to having them actively retrieve. It's easy. It can be done.
Yeah, that specificity matters, right? Let's talk
Yeah.
about the specific things that we're doing and happening and learning. And that works, for students, adults alike, and everybody can respond better to a specific question. The last question here is thinking about the new book, The Parent Guide. I think there's, parents are, of course, a key audience here, but not the only ones who can make good use of this book. In your words, who should use this book, and how should they use it?
I hope parents will use it. I hope students will use it. It unlocks learning in an accessible way. Stories from my 25 years of teaching, parents, stories with parents that I've worked with. It is now, when we think about the parents of our students, so much of the science of learning simply was not available. Yet, parents have been through the educational system and most likely were successful, and so they want to go back to how they learned. But we now know better. We now have better strategies, ways to make learning stick. And so I highly recommend parents, students, teachers too. It's a nice, short guide, but it packs a punch.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Patrice, thank you so much for being with us here today. And I know, before we let you go here, that you have your website, you have your social media presence, different ways for listeners to connect with you. Before you go, are there any other resources, first of all, that you want to recommend, but also how can listeners connect and learn more about your work?
Well, I would love to have you visit my site, which is www.patricebain.com. And I have various articles and webinars, podcasts that I've done if you would like a little bit more research. I would love to have you follow me on Twitter. I am at Patrice Bain 1. And I highly suggest, if you are a Twitter fan, there is fabulous research. I have made so many connections with people in the UK, with people all across America, with people everywhere. In fact, my co-author of Powerful Teaching, Pooja Agarwal, and I have an online group at facebook.com/groups/powerful teaching. And we have teachers from over 51 countries all around the world. And it's another great way to connect with like-minded teachers. I would hope that your people listening in will also go to Pooja's site, which is retrievalpractice.org, which has great information on research and how it applies in, again, very user-friendly, quick, accessible. So as teachers, we don't have time to get bogged down in journals and so many research studies. But the information is there now and it's accessible. It's user-friendly, and take advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again, Patrice Bain, for joining us here today. Listeners, make sure to check out our website, connect on Twitter, check out the Powerful Teaching Facebook group, and of course, look for Powerful Teaching, A Guide for Parents, the brand new book coming out from Catt Educational. Thanks again, Patrice.
Thank you so much for having me.